Hello and good evening. Are you all hearing me? Let's see if I got them here. Hello and welcome. All right, everyone, just give me a moment while I try and get this moving. There we go. I think I'm hearing noise. I'm hearing music, or rather, I'm hearing sound. Are you hearing me, Reverend Kwame?
We can indeed hear you live and alive. A very pleasant good evening to the live listening audience of Indaba, the place where knowledge grows. Of course, we are so happy on tonight to have a very special guest in no less a person than Dr. Rachel Knox, a personal family friend, a sister that shares several boards with me as we both champion comprehensive health equity within the global space. Of course, we are in the month of April being Cannabis Awareness Month. Now, if I were to go through your very illustrious CV, some of which I definitely would want to touch on during the course of tonight's program, we would be here perhaps to the end of the segment. But suffice it to say, Dr. Rachel Knox is an endocannabinologist, and for those that are unaware, that is a specialty within medicine that deals with, of course, the use of cannabinoids in a very safe and effective way within a family medicine environment to bring about, of course, health and wellness. Of course, she will talk more about that when we give her the opportunity. But live from Oregon on tonight, we do have the very illustrious speaker, TED Talk slam dunker. I know I'm inventing a word here, but your TED Talk has one of the greatest reviews that I've seen online, and you definitely slam dunk that for the cannabis community. A very pleasant good night to you, Dr. Rachel from Trinidad and Tobago. How are you, and how are you doing?
I'm well. I'm very pleased to be here. I do hear an echo when I'm talking. Don't know if you all can hear that, but
It's slight, but definitely bearable. You go right ahead.
okay. No, I'm so happy to be here. You're right. We would be at it for a long time. We talked about everything both you and I are involved with for the betterment of our community. So I'm eager to get into the conversation.
Absolutely. Now to start on a controversial note, Rastafari, of course, you know Rastafari, has been around since the turn of what we would call the 20th century, and they've been advocating cannabis as medicine. When we listen to Peter Tosh, when we listen to Bob Marley, when we listen to all the greats of Rastafari, they would talk about it as medicine. They are not alone within the spiritual community. We know that within China, from ancient times, it has been a part of their pharmacopoeia. We know within ancient Kemet, within ancient Egypt, it goes by the name of Shemshemet, and it absolutely has been a part of their industry, their medicine, their way of life there in ancient Kemet. Even within Israel, which is a surprise for many persons, they too have made great use of this plant. It's part of the holy anointing oil. For those who are tuned in on tonight, you can find that in Exodus chapter 30, verse 23 and onward. Yahuwah is speaking to Moses. He is giving him the ingredients list for making the most holy oil, which must anoint not only the prophets, not only the priests, but every furniture in the tabernacle and in the temple must be anointed with this sacred oil in order for it to be Kodesh or sanctified. So within the religious community, not forgetting, of course, Hindu community, they use it in their veneration of Lord Shiva within their pujas. So it's very well attested within the ancient world. It seems to be a part of the pharmacopoeia, part of their medicine chest, certainly part of their sacrament, part of their industrial use. But for many in today's society, the question is Is that ancient hype? Were they simply making a big hullabaloo about nothing? Is it simply ancient men and women getting a holy high and dreaming up all kinds of fanciful uses for cannabis? Here you are, a medical doctor, family medicine trained endocannabinologist. Would you give credence to cannabis as truly medicine? And if so, please attest to it by way of your own personal experience as well as the literature that can solidify that for us on tonight.
Sure. Is there a background? Okay, we're good. Endocannabinology, me being an endocannabinologist, really speaks to, yes, it's a subspecialty in medicine that doctors like me and other health professionals like me in this space are pioneering. But like we have cardiologists and endocrinologists and neurologists, this growing body of knowledge around the endocannabinoid system is really requiring that healthcare providers, have a command over the science that is the endocannabinoid system, its normal function, its dysfunction, and how to modulate it, right? How to treat it when its dysfunction manifests as illness, as conditions, as diagnosable disease processes. Research dating as far back as the early 2000s, maybe late 90s, early 2000s, have revealed what we now really believe are signs that there exist endocannabinoid deficiency syndromes. Conditions like PTSD, even autism, are conditions that if you test cerebral spinal fluid, you will see a low level of circulating anandamide. Anandamide is a cannabinoid our bodies make all by itself. Now,
pause one quick second, Dr. Knox. You just dropped a bomb there. And as a good interviewer, I can't allow that to slide without very honorable mention. The bomb you dropped is that we seem, based on our genome and based on the tests that you do within the lab, to have what we would call cannabinoid deficiency syndromes. So in breaking it down for the layman, in the same way we need vitamin C or else we'll get scurvy. Yep. In the same way we need vitamin D or we'll get rickets. In the same way we'll need protein or we'll end up with kwashiorkor or something of that like. You are telling us on tonight that cannabinoids are a part of our essential diet, and without it in sufficient amounts, we will suffer what we would call deficiency syndromes. Is that what you're saying on tonight?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. I think the jury's still out on whether that this is a chicken or an egg scenario where illness erupts and as a consequence we're deficient in cannabinoids, or if illnesses are truly generated from inherent or genetic or chronic condition that is driving down the cannabinoids in our system. Now, endocannabinoid system dysfunction goes beyond the classic endocannabinoid deficiency, where the receptors of the system might be at low levels too, and our body isn't able to generate them, or it could be hyperactive, and we have some diseases that we've aligned with the hyperactivity of the endocannabinoid system. But the crux of it is this: we all have endocannabinoid systems. Our endocannabinoid systems predate cannabis on this earth. And the endocannabinoid system begins working at conception and doesn't stop working until we die. And let me repeat again, our endocannabinoid systems predate the cannabis plant. So we've had cannabinoids functioning inside of our bodies for eons. Cannabis happens to have molecules also called cannabinoids. They were called cannabinoids first when we discovered the first cannabinoids. Our cannabinoids are named after them. But these cannabinoids can mimic directly or indirectly the behavior of our own endogenous cannabinoids within our bodies. And so, Ambassador Reverend, you hit the nail on the head. That the really the analogy that beckons our attention and our respect, which is, yes, if we're deficient in vitamin D, we look for exogenous, external, right, bottled up vitamin D to supplement our bodies with. Where we might have an endocannabinoid deficiency, say I have PTSD, that is a classic example of endocannabinoid deficiency. THC, the molecule THC, is notably analogous, right, similar in activity to anandamide. So I have PTSD and I have anandamide deficiency, just like I pick up a vitamin to treat vitamin A deficiency, I could pick DHC by way of whole plant flower or a product extract of cannabis to treat my PTSD. And as a matter of fact, it was my first PTSD patients that helped me connect this dot. Most of the patients I saw with PTSD told me they benefited from higher THC cannabis cultivars or strains. It's no wonder they were benefiting from high THC product, because it's the THC again that is analogous to the anandamide that they are, according to research, deficient in. So I want to finish answering your question quickly with this. It wasn't until the 1980s, 90s that we could articulate knowledge around the system in our bodies that cannabis works upon. Prior to that, it was more of a knowing that cannabis was medicine. Now we have the receipts, as you like to say.
I absolutely love to put it that way. Another controversial question. So, question number one, and you've answered it in very technical terms, but you certainly did respond, and definitely cannabis is medicine. So, the Hindu Vedic tradition, the Chinese medicine men, the ancient Kemetic medicine men, the Rastafari medicine men, they weren't crazy, they weren't mad, they weren't schizophrenic. They were on the money all along. But science has only just caught up by way of the testing and the receipts now to prove the efficacy of again, this very powerful botanical plant. In Trinidad and Tobago, and certainly within the Caribbean, there have been many arrests for cannabis. There has been, as it were, within the Rastafari community, a loss of your dreadlocks, because especially back in the 1970s and 80s, if you are arrested for cannabis possession, they would cut off your dreadlocks. I don't know what one thing has to do with the other, but certainly these post-colonial, some would call them neo-colonial constructs, just like to interfere with your sovereignty. Tell us about the experience in the US of A. In Trinidad and in the Caribbean, more often than not, Afro-Trinidadians, Afro-Jamaicans, Afro-Bajans, Afro-Antiguans, Afro-St. Lucians seem to have borne the brunt of this war on drugs. Is that the same experience that you have there in the US? And what, if anything, have you and your organizations been doing to right this very historic wrong?
Mm-hmm. I think many of us would agree that the war on drugs has been a war on people this whole time, and it has been a war of global proportion. Yep, in the United States, we have the data that prove that Black, followed by Indigenous, followed by Latinos, have borne the brunt of prohibition. We even have evidence that this was intentional, that the criminalization of not just cannabis, but other natural substances were to criminalize people. Now, there's also controversy around plant industrial utility, and so there were a lot of political, a lot of economic, players that also were involved. They were in cahoots with those who wanted to harm people for the protection of big business as well. But that just goes to show how layered this war and how complex this war has really been. But at the beginning of the end of the day, beginning with slavery in the United States, I like to say cannabis has been a tool that has been weaponized against principally Black Americans, but all of brown people as well. In this space, I'm from Oregon. Oregon was one of the states to first legalize cannabis here in the States. We legalized in 1998, 2 years after California. And so that was 98. We didn't legalize adult use until 2015. Point is, we've had legal cannabis for a very long time. And in states like ours, we continue to see disproportionate arrests. Arrest rates have gone down, but when you pull the books, when you pull the data, when our police bureaus provide it, it is clear. We're continuing to be over-policed. And in a state like Oregon that actually decriminalized all drugs back in 2020, I think we have yet to see what improvements we have made since then, and indeed if our data is still skewed disproportionately in our communities. Now, in 2015 is when I entered Oregon as a doctor who saw patients using cannabis. And it was very quickly that I recognized that the laws that had passed in Oregon, the regulations as the law has been interpreted, have done more harm than good in the long term with respect to affordable access to cannabis as medicine in our state for all people. Oregon does not have a large population of Black and brown people. It is significant, but by comparison, that is true. And I say that to also say, or to juxtapose what I'm going to say, and maybe give my state some grace, that Black and brown people weren't the predominant folks in my clinic even. Now in Oregon, it might be a numbers game, but I also think that our communities are the last to jump and come to clinic to get cannabis as medicine because of the history of criminalization and stigma that surrounds cannabis use. I just don't think we're that eager to get our hands on cannabis for our healing now publicly. It doesn't mean that we're not still engaging with the plants in our own community and with community. So I have to say that. But anyways, from this vantage point, as a clinician, recognizing that rules and regs were not benefiting patients, recognizing that Black and brown patients were the last to consider cannabis as an option for them when we are suffering at unprecedented rates of the very conditions cannabis can treat. I wanted to get involved in policy and regulation, and I did. I started to join boards at that time too that were all around social equity and making sure that the people most harmed by the criminalization of this plant had opportunity. And I wasn't really hearing conversation around the utility, right? The utility of this plant to create innovations in food, medicine, industry, agriculture, as the solution, right, to the health and wealth disparities that criminalization created. In my mind, I was like, this is easy. This is 1 + 1 = 2.
No-brainer, absolute no-brainer.
Right? Why aren't we talking about using this plant to fix the problems that criminalization caused? And so, because that was the conversation I wanted to have, I came up with this cannabis health equity movement, CHEM, and tapped a few folks in my neighborhood and within the cannabis family in the United States who aren't in Oregon. And we're like, what do y'all think about this? Long story short, we co-founded the Cannabis Health Equity Movement's engines, the nonprofit corporations that make this movement go. The first was ACHEM, which you are a board member of, our Association for Cannabis Health Equity in Medicine. The whole purpose of this organization is to increase the ranks of Black and brown healers and health professionals around the knowledge, the knowing of cannabis science, endocannabinology, and health equity. And we have a C3 nonprofit too, Chem Alliance with a Y, which is our education and professional development nonprofit. Where we care to introduce the concept of cannabis as a tool for achieving health equity to youth, K
Powerful.
through 14 and beyond. And this year, I'm really happy that we are beginning to do the work to launch by the end of this year our farming cooperative, Chem Cooperative, and our small business association as well, our
Congrats.
coalition, Chem Coalition. So that's what
There
I'm
you
doing.
go. So in just a synopsis, in your response, not only are you involved in the medical component, again serving families and individuals, and certainly because of stigma and discrimination, so few of our people come forward to access. We definitely have to work on that through awareness, through education, pushing that. But beyond dealing with again the medicine side, you decided to get involved in the policy side, in the regulation side of things, and here you are now even in the economic space driving cannabis cooperatives. When do you get to sleep is the question that one would naturally ask, coming at the back end of that. We are climaxing to the end of this interview. What would be your concluding thoughts for the African community, for the Black community, whether on the continent or in the diaspora? Should they hold on to this taboo nature of cannabis, or should they get involved in every segment and sector of cannabis that they can? Because one of the things that I've been recognizing is that the people who were a part of the dystopia, the war on people in the name of the war on drugs, are the ones that are first in line to be a part of the commercialization process. And so the people who are throwing us behind bars are the very people who are benefiting most now. What will be your last thoughts to our community in terms of encouragement to join this great cannabis space?
Yeah, two things. The first is that it was our people who cultivated the earliest knowledge around how to handle this plant, right? How to preserve it, protect it, respect it, regard it, cultivate it, process it into the things that we use for our benefit, whether that was medical or spiritual or otherwise. I like to say cannabis is our legacy. We need to know that history, and there's much more to that history, but we need to know that history so that we can identify with the wisdom that our people, again, cultivated around this plant. We need to claim that. That's the first thing I want to say. No longer can we afford to hold stigma ourselves for this plant that did so much for us for so long. And I think we can be proud about the historical record. And with that pride, be the first ones in line to say, no, we're going to use this plant, for our good. Right? We're going to bring benevolence back to this plant and its purpose and its utility. And yet we're going to get involved in every aspect, 360 degrees of what the bioeconomy of cannabis, right? Hemp and cannabis can and should be, again, for our benefit. I like to say that, health equity, unless we are using cannabis solutions to achieve health equity in the communities that have been most divested of their access to it, Black and Brown, we can ensure that everybody will. Those people who are now stepping on our heads and necks and backs again to be first in line, we have to withstand that. We have to challenge it. And I think that's going to be collectively knowing where we came from and collectively agreeing to where we want to go together. I think the cannabis health equity movement is really special because we recognize that we all wear different hats. My primary hat is a medical doctor. You wear a different role in the movement, and everyone else that are in the movement with us, wear their respective hats and do their respective thing. And it's together, working together, that we are going to cover 360 degrees of this bioeconomy. So we can't leave any of us out. We need to step up to the plate here together. And that camaraderie creates the confidence we need to move. It creates the intelligence that we need to move.
1000%. I just wish Oh, I
So
tell you, we could go on and on and on. I wish we had the entire program to talk about this topic,
yes,
but
I feel you.
unfortunately we don't. So at this point in time, we close. We've been talking to Dr. Rachel Knox, a medical doctor, MBA out of course, the state of Oregon. Again, endocannabinologist specialist, indeed agreeing with us that cannabis is indeed medicine. And now we turn back to Sister Karen, who's going to take us, of course, into the lotto break and all of the other fantastic things that
All right, folks. So let's take a moment, a break, and come right back with more from Indaba.
Thank you, Father. For centuries, we have been.
Am I on now?
Oh, Africa, my mother's children, heed the call of the father. My mother's children, heed the call to come together. My mother's children finally came together. Everybody walking together. Everybody loving each other. And the people chanting together. Where we chanting? Shinaba, Shinaba, emancipation. Yeah. That's an emancipation. Emancipation.
Okay, we are now joining.
Yes, Indaba team, I don't know what's going on. Zakia, you're supposed to speak about the ESC's program at this point. Sister Zach? Sister Zach? Yes, good evening, greetings, listeners to Indaba. Greetings, Indaba team. The Africa report is on now, but unfortunately, we have a little hiccup. One of those few moments when I have a guest, but the guest is having some issues. in getting on to the platform. So let me just give you a brief overview of what we were going to discuss, and we are going to defer the meat of the matter for the next edition of Indaba. Now, there's a raging controversy over a film that is called Queen Cleopatra. And of course, filmology is one of the most powerful tools for promoting ideas and values of a particular country or a particular civilization. In this film by Netflix, which I believe is yet to be released, but that is imminent, the African American actress named Adele James plays the lead role of Queen Cleopatra, who was the last ruler of the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, and whose death in 30 BC marked the formal end of what we call Pharaonic Egypt, which also is called ancient Egypt, and or Kemet, the preferred name by our Pan-Africanist community. Now, the fact I believe that the director of the film, Tina Garavi, is Iranian born, I believe that might have added some political spice to the controversy. Those of us who know the Iranian connection with respect to even Egypt or America and NATO and so on would understand. Now, a number of nationalities have jumped into the fray to condemn the film, to condemn the actress, to condemn the director. These include some Greeks, some Turks, some Egyptians, and even some Israelis who expressed outrage over the color of the skin of the actress, as well, of course, the race of Adele James, saying she has no right to play Cleopatra because Cleopatra did not look like her. Even a lawyer, an Egyptian lawyer, has gone to court to prevent the previewing of the film. And of course, since we can say about the 1780s, when a Frenchman by the name of Comte de Volney went to Egypt and saw these huge sculptures like the Great Sphinx of Giza and so on, and he was convinced that this civilization was indeed African. The ruling class was African. The gods were African, you know, and he went back and propagated that message. But even then, since then, there has been this reaction to reinvent the demography of Egypt, to remove Africans from Egypt, except, you know, as workers and slaves and so on, and to insert Caucasian demography into the ruling class as such. Now, film has been used to help in this reinvention and to whiten the natives, especially, you know, I think the rulers and the gods. So if you cast your mind back, for example, to the Ten Commandments, which was a 1950s film, you had Yul Brynner. Yul Brynner was Ramesses II. Now, Yul Brynner, of course, a white American. Then there were several Ramesses films after that. The latest I know about 2014, when even in the era of woke, there was no protest when a white Australian played the role of Ramesses II, you know. And even in the role of Cleopatra, the new film is not the only film that had been filmed before. The most famous, best known, I believe, is that of the 1963 film in which Elizabeth Taylor acted as Cleopatra. There was no outcry then. So Tina Garavi, who is Iranian born, remembers this Taylor depiction of Cleopatra. And this is what she said, even as a little girl. She said, I felt the image was not right. Was her skin really that white? And so, speaking ideologically about her own film, she said that the film is intended to release Cleopatra from the stranglehold that Hollywood had placed on her image. So let me land on this for now, because next week we hope to resolve the issues we are having now. And I would bring on my guest, who is Dr. Madiha Farag Miller. And she is Egyptian born, Egyptian educated, but she's now living in Trinidad. She got her Master of Philosophy in Trinidad at UWI and her PhD in Tasmania. So is well qualified to speak on these issues. She is a specialist in archaeology. She studied archaeology in Egypt. So let me land on this point. This is what Tina Garavi said. She said, while shooting the film, I became the target of a huge online hate campaign. Egyptians accused me of blackwashing and stealing their history. Some threatened to ruin my career. No amount of reasoning or reminders that the Arab invaders or the Arab invasions had not yet happened in Cleopatra's age seemed to stem the tide of ridiculous comments. Of course, the Arabs who dominate demographically in Egypt now were nowhere around in the era of pharaonic Egypt. They invaded Egypt, conquered Egypt in the year 642 AD, and they have been there as a dominant race. Somehow the Arabs have a feeling that ancient Egyptian civilization is theirs. You see? So all that is part of the issue here in trying to stop the portrayal of an Egyptian woman from being portrayed by an African American woman. So we are going to talk about this next week. We are going to hear from Dr. Farag Miller. Hopefully during the week, we are going to sort the issues out and we would have some smooth sailing on next week. So that's an abbreviated version of the African report for this week. Over to you, Brother Shabaka.
All right, folks, we're going to have Shabaka coming in and speaking with Dr. Salandi on the 1970 Black Power Revolution. Unfinished business. Let's go in. Shabaka?
All right. Good night. And it's a pleasure to be here with you, my friends, not just here in Trinidad and Tobago, across the Caribbean, but indeed across the world on Indaba, the place where knowledge grows. Special good night, of course, to Vanessa, our previous host in City 91.1. Of course, she's no longer part of the 91.1 family, but she'll always be part of the Indaba family. Good night, Dr. Tahimba. Since we don't have much time, let's get right into it. And of course, we still have, Dr. Knox with us, so she'll join us perhaps before the end of the conversation. But we are now talking about the Black Power Revolution. We are here just after that important anniversary, the 21st of April, when the government declared the state of emergency, effectively beginning a new wave of suppression of the movement. You spoke at the 50th anniversary conference, which took place this year because the actual 50th anniversary was during the COVID period. Your presentation was entitled Black Power Repression and Regrowth, an analysis of NUF and Trinidad Rastafarians. Can you restate your thesis for us, Dr. Tahimba?
Sure. So my main idea, and a pleasant good night to you and all your listeners. My main idea was that there's a need for us to reconceptualize the entire 1970s, to shift past the initial events, to also include the actions and activities by trade unionists, the National United Freedom Fighters, the situation in the army with Shah and Lascelles, who was part of a very important mutiny there, as well as the Rastafarians, who are often left out of the equation. So in terms of our understanding of 1970s, I think that there's still a lot more that we need to uncover and learn about that period, and there isn't enough discussions and understanding so that we could harness all of those lessons and use it to chart something better and different in the contemporary time.
Okay, and of course, I'm going to run through the conference with you, the different what you call it, different panels, and we're going to pull out the things that stood out to you. But I want to
Okay,
say,
sure.
in principle, that I agree with your thesis, and I don't want to stop at the Rastafarians. I think that one of the things that McCandle Daga did in the 70s, along with the leadership of NJAC, was to set up a regional coordinating committee, and that regional coordinating committee would have met with leaders of that generation. And when we think about Black Power Revolution, we think about a small group, but really they had distinguished themselves among a whole generation born in the 1940s who demanded more from independence, who were prepared to sacrifice and paying the ultimate price for the freedoms to increase the freedoms we were going to enjoy from independence. And they came from all walks of life, all across the region. And one of the things that NJAC did is that they assumed an important role in across the region. And of course, Maurice Bishop would have been one of those who met in that regional coordinating committee, and that would have given impetus to the New Jewel movement in Grenada, which I think so. When we talk about the revolution, there's a lot more still to be discussed that hasn't been discussed. I want to agree with you there. Let's go to the first panel: religious and cultural shifts as a response to the 1970 revolution. What stood out to you there? And of course, on that panel were Corey Gilks, Dr. Hatshepsut, Nolene, Kissa Davidson, and Marissa Duncan.
Okay, so that whole panel was reorganized, so there were some changes there.
That's correct.
Um,
That's correct.
yes.
The only Corey Gilks was part. He then moved to the second panel. So the first thing that took place then would have been the roundtable discussion, which would
Yes,
have
yes.
included Augustus Ramrekha Singh, Clive Nunes, Kafra Kambon, and Ferdy Ferreira. So we had two veterans of the 1970 revolution, or three veterans, and Ferdy Ferreira, who represented the PNM, representing the power at the time. Tell us what stood out to you from that round
What
table.
was very insightful about that panel is that we got a lot of first-hand accounts of what happened, and it kind of brought out some very fresh perspectives as persons were able to really share things that they were a part of. One interesting aspect of that panel was some questions raised by Dr. Fudi Ferreira, who questioned his confusion as to why a Black Power movement would challenge a black government. So that caused a very intense and heated discussion and engaging and engagement with the audience, who put forward counterpoints that showed that really said that it was really a neo-colonial type government, and hence, given the inequalities and issues within the society, there was a need for the Black Power movement to challenge the so-called black government.
Given the fact that Ferdy was saying that all these decades after the 1970s, you think that PNM is, in general, is still of the view that they were the Black Power movement that was needed, and the NJAC represented some kind of radical fringe, that undermined the work that they were doing on behalf of the people.
Well, I think that the very idea that the PNM is some black government is very flawed and distorted. So we in the Caribbean here have a legacy of leaders who may more look like us, but do not necessarily represent our interests. So the mere fact that we had that change after independence didn't mean that all of these structures of coloniality just disappeared. They continued in new forms. And I think that we have had more than 50 years to learn that the structures of colonialism has continued.
Okay, let me just play devil's advocate before we move on quickly, or let's just say that the government led by Dr. Eric Williams did make efforts within the parameters of what they understood or what they could, I guess that particular segment of the population could conceptualize. So, and of course, we know now that those changes were quite limited in scope. A good example would be what happened with the education system, but we'll get into that at another day. Let's go to the second panel now, which would have included Professor Hamid Ghani, Mbau Mohini, and Victor Moore. This panel was called The Black Power Revolution and Its Dimensions. And of course, Brother Corey Jilks would have joined them in that panel, which turned out to be the first panel for the day. What stood out to
Well,
you?
this was another very exciting panel. And firstly, we have Professor Hamid Ghani actually going and getting declassified documents that showed us what were some of the concerns shared by the British American governments, as well as what was the response by Williams. So we don't have to guess, but we could actually see concerns by these dominant Western powers that Williams could be overthrown. And as such, you had warships stationed outside Trinidad and Tobago in case something happened, they then could actually step in.
Yeah.
So that was a very insightful panel.
One of the things that Dr. Ghani, one of the arguments that he made was that Williams, banned Kwame Ture, or then Stokely Carmichael, in advance of the Black Power movement, as if he had some kind of premonition or a sense that the society would go in that direction, and he felt that Kwame Ture would of course have heightened the environment considerably. What is your take on that?
So that is true, but in a sense, that is nothing new because there has been centuries of a history of repression against any ideas, knowledge, and persons who were anti-imperialist, Marxist, leftist, or black. So, for example, that same law that was used to ban Stokely Carmichael from Trinidad, that same law, which is called the law of undesirables, was used to prevent Marcus Garvey from coming to Trinidad in the 1920s. So it was actually created way back when to prevent certain persons who they feared would have had a certain impact on the population to be actually able to visit our country.
Yeah, let me also add that for the purpose of our listeners who may not be so familiar with Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, he was born on what is now Oxford Street, or what we intend to call Kwame Ture Street in Trinidad and Port of Spain. And he would have been the one in 1966 who popularized the term Black Power, which then swept the world in the same way that the phrase Black Lives Matters did in 2021 and became the rallying cry of people in the social justice or racial justice movement everywhere. And so Dr. Williams banned him, Trinidadian-born Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture, in, I think it was 1968. And it was not until the NAR government was in power under A&R Robinson that ban was lifted. I think that was in the 1990s. And so, of course, Dr. Ghani said it was attributed that to Pandey, but of course it was, in fact, Robinson who lifted the ban. Very important. Let's move to the next round. Let me just add that when Dr. Samaru spoke, he pointed out that Williams was so obsessed with making sure that Kwame Ture didn't come to Trinidad that he didn't even want him in the airport. There was specific rules that would have debarred him from the airport. And I see Dr. Knox is with us. Dr. Knox, you're familiar with Stokely Carmichael, right? Of course you did. I'm sure this is the first time you're learning that he was banned from his home country of Trinidad. Let me know by a shake of the head there. I think you're muted. Okay, let's move on to the next round table. This round table included Brother Ayagoro Ome, Josan Leonard, so two more veterans of the struggle. Ivan Lachlan, another veteran of the struggle. And interestingly, Sri Ravi G. Tell me what stood out for you from that panel.
Right, so I missed that panel, so I'll have to go on to the next day.
Let me just say, quite interestingly, that Brother Ivan Lachlan was the only, in his own words, one of two white people in the March to Caroni. Very interesting. He represents a very interesting element in the struggle at the time, and of course, so that was quite an interesting. That panel was described the quest for national unity. It was one of those interesting panels where the presenters all spoke about their experience, but not quite getting around to the question of unity directly. But of course, a lot of important things to take away from that panel. Then we had the second day, the third panel, which was the social and political environment in response to the Black Power movement. And that was your panel. And you were there, of course, with Professor Emeritus Dr. Brinsley Samaru and Carol Hossain. Tell me what stood out with you from your co-presenters.
Well, certainly from Professor Brinsley Samaru, he was able to really share how Professor or Dr. Williams was caught between talking the rhetoric of the Black Power movement and repressing it. So Eric Williams is on record in saying that he was for the Black Power movement and he actually was influenced by it in nationalizing aspects of our industry. Yet in many ways, the Black Power movement of that time was severely repressed. Leaders were jailed, and there were actually police killing squads that was part of the 1970s.
Indeed, indeed. So, of course, Dr. Eric Williams, when we look back on history, it's hard to decide where to put him because of the amount of different contradictions that appear in his tenure. Now we move on to the next panel, which was, of course, Sophia Edwards, Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine, Dr. Priya Mohan, and they looked at Black Power and development thrusts in Trinidad and Tobago, perspective on enterprise, entrepreneurship, and legislative reform.
Hello,
So
everyone.
it's quite difficult to give a brief summary of all of these complex and dynamic panels, but certainly
Just let me
this
know what
was
stood out for you, brother, quickly, because we're going to run through. We want to bring in our guests, and I'm hoping that even though we're going to lose our listeners on 91.1 at 9 on the dot, we're going to keep our listeners on YouTube, that is TTESC, and on the Emancipation Support Committee's Facebook page, so we can have a short discussion with co-panelists and,
Let
of
me,
course, Dr. Fox.
hello, Shabaka.
And
I just wanted to interrupt just a second. We have a call on the air.
let's take that call while we still have time.
All right. You're on.
Greetings.
Hey, brother Balagoon, we haven't heard from you in a while.
This is Balagoon. In the 1970s, there was a steering committee set up by NJAC of the Caribbean leaders to form themselves into a steering committee to go to the Fifth African Congress. And Eric Williams banned those fellas, those brothers from the country, never to return to this country. Brothers like Carl Blackwood from Jamaica, Tim Hector, Antigua, Rosie Douglas, Walter Rodney. All these brothers was in Trinidad, was to go to Tanzania to report on the leaders of the Caribbean who was portraying to be black, telling the African continent what was going on in this country, that what the Black Power movement is doing is not right, that we were going to report on the ills of the treatment of black people in the Caribbean by these so-called black leaders like Bonham and this man from Grenada.
Yeah.
And
Brother, thank you very much for your question. Thank you very much for your question, Brother Balagoon. I'm going to let Dr. Salandi respond to that. Dr. Salandi, are you aware that Carl Blackwood, who was one of the respected members of the struggle in that period, and others were banned when they left Trinidad?
Yes, I am.
So that is actually correct.
Yes, that just fits into a whole model of using the law and certain entry points to really have a certain type of control over a movement that was threatening the government at that point in time.
Indeed. Thank you very much, for your contribution, brother. And now the next panel, and I think we must touch on this panel, included the Archbishop of Trinidad and Tobago, the Catholic Archbishop Jason Gordon. This panel was called the Black Power Revolution: Past, Contemporary, and Future Currents. And his presentation was called Black Power Revolution Unfinished. And of course, he was joined by Brother Enyahuma Obika, who spoke on the 21st century, the African century, and Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard. What stood out for you, I mean, from that panel?
Well, I actually disagreed publicly with some of the utterances of Jason Gordon because while he talked about families being broken, I don't think that he dealt properly with the role of the Catholic Church in the underdevelopment of various
Yes.
families and communities.
Powerful point.
And so we could say that the Catholic Church, including children's homes and schools, have been one of the pillars of racism, colonial ideas, and a lack of
Yes,
respect
it
for
has.
diversity. And I'm not just talking about something that happened in the past, but something that happens today. So today, children are in various children homes, and there are actually administrators who would actually force them to engage in certain Christian rituals, even though they are not Christians. We have also dominant religious schools that are bastions of racism and a lack of respect for diversity. So some of the ideas that your natural hair needs to be changed or is somehow unworthy actually is very strong and prominent in a lot of these religious schools. And I know that because my sister went to a religious Catholic school in the West. And they actually were encouraging young girls to relax and straighten their hair, and cornrows, were actually banned. So I don't think that the Archbishop is really being honest in terms of the role of the church in the continued underdevelopment of our society.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting theme here on Indaba over the last couple of weeks, because just 2 weeks ago, or maybe the last 2 weeks, we interviewed an indigenous couple from the United States of America responding to the Catholic Church's repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. And in that statement by the Holy See, they were pointing out that the Catholic Church did not take full responsibility. It blamed the things, the decrees that it made, which underpinned colonialism, on manipulation by certain colonial governments and so on. When I was in Geneva last year for the historic first conference of the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, everybody in that forum was disturbed by the presentation by the Holy See, which didn't seem to take full responsibility for its role in the historic underdevelopment, the historic colonial process, which undermined the development among so many people of color all across the world. So that theme continues. But let's say, though, that there were some really good things that came out of Archbishop Gordon's presentation. I have to say that there were some things that he said that I did not anticipate or expect him to say. We don't have time to go into it now, but let's close off by let's look at the last table, which was the 1970 revolution and its impact on Trinidad and Tobago, with Philip Rochford, Opukuware, Dr. Olabisi Kuboni, and Professor Patrick Watson. What stood out for you from you there? And of course, we're talking about its impact on the country.
Yes, well, this panel was very insightful in terms of understanding the impact of 1970 on Tobago. And we often leave out Tobago in terms of a societal understanding of the events of 1970. So certainly, Opokowari and Dr. Kuboni was able to center the experiences, of Tobago.
Brother Kahimba, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but for the purpose of our listeners on 91.1, if you want to continue in the discussion, please turn to YouTube, TTESC, or Facebook. Go to Facebook and look for the Emancipation Support Committee page. We're going to have 15 more minutes of what we call Indaba Overtime, starting tonight.
Nice,
with
nice.
these illustrious group that we have here. So if you don't want to leave this conversation, I know some of you don't want this conversation to end, you jump in there. Now we're going to get into the real heated stuff. So I want to thank you, Karen, for hosting us here on 91.1.
Thank you. I forgot I can actually talk.
All right, so one love to you and one love to our listeners, and please join us on Facebook or YouTube. All right. So, Doctor, continue, Dr. Salandi.
Yes. So my main point is that there's just so many things that are that are really unfinished in terms of our understanding of 1970, and we have to not just put together the narratives from the academics and those who may have been more prominent within the 1970s, but we need to uncover the whole spectrum of the movement, including those who may not have been actively involved with any organization, but may have been in their own space and their own community and being part of the process of decolonization.
Yes, yes, very interesting. Now, let me bring Dr. Fergus, Reverend Kwame Kamau, and Dr. Knox into the conversation now. Now that we've sort of covered those areas, is there anything, and perhaps Dr. Fergus, let me start with you, that you'd like to raise? Anything that we have not addressed, or what we've touched on perhaps that needs some more elaboration?
Well, I may have a question for Brother Taimba, but I think that the question about the banning, what occurred to me was the banning actually started before the Black Power Revolution. Remember the banning of Walter Rodney. So if it was a particular position taken by the PNM government about revolutionary leadership in the Caribbean. So I think we need to go back a little and see there was continuity in the banning because people continued to be banned into the 1970s. But in looking at other civil rights, black power, black consciousness movements around the world, we tend to discern a common black consciousness philosophy. I am not sure if there is a distinct philosophy that was propagated in Trinidad and Tobago that we can say was black. And if you look at the banner of the Black Power marches and so on, Africans and Indians unite now. Trinidad is the only place I know that combines this dual racial element into a black concept. I know, Shabaka, you are passionate about this thing, right? You are a child of the revolution, a true child of the a child of the banner, may I say? You're a child of the banner, right? So I understand that, but Trinidad is the only place that tried to cosmopolitanize the black power concept. Could Tahimba speak to that? Was that a positive thing, or was it something that really would have, in a sense, complicated the movement and perhaps help to bring it down? Because we know that Williams was assisted by Badis Mirage because of that fear of Indians coming together with Africans. Part of the push that Williams got was from the Indian religious political trade union leader, Badis Sagan Marat. So could you speak to that in terms of ideology and in terms of the cosmopolitanism of the Black Power movement in the
Yeah,
1970s?
sure. So I think that it also happened in Guyana, where Walter Rodney also included Indians within his whole concept of being black. But I think that that question is very complicated because many Indians did not see themselves as being black and would have had very negative perceptions of blackness based upon the Hindu caste system. So although you had some very prominent Indians being, seriously involved in the Black Power movement, I think that there were very diverse ideas and thoughts about Indian involvement in the Black Power movement. I don't think that the groundwork was properly done for Indian and African collaboration in order to understand a whole complex set of histories that were major stumbling blocks in terms of interracial collaboration. But still, it was one of the main historical events in which that inter-ethnic collaboration really threatened the government and really showed the possibilities of what could come forward from that sort of wide social movement.
Yeah. I will
Okay,
quickly
I will
add.
read to that. How should, that's a brief question, and a brief response would be required as well. How should the future academics in particular remember and define 1970? Is it the Black Power Revolution, or some people are propagating the Trinidad and Tobago Revolution because it ties into the cosmopolitanism of the marches, the protest organization, and so on? How should the revolution be remembered as in terms of titling it, and how is it an appropriate title? Should we go in that direction? What do you think about it?
So I think that the very
I know I'm putting
idea
you on
of
the
the word
spot. I'm
black
putting
is
you on the
important.
spot, but that's my nature. I put you on the spot. Yeah.
Yeah,
Go
sure.
ahead.
So I think that the term black is important given people's negative connotations and imagery around the term black that we need to decolonize. So I think that that is important. Yet at the same time, I have observed that even leading members of the so-called Black Power movement said that the movement was not about Black Power. So there are different views, and that diversity, I think, needs to be faced, and we need to really continue to uncover all the diverse voices, including Indian voices who were a part of the movement or who would have had experiences around the movement.
All right, I want to address both of those questions now quickly. Let me just point out that when you have movements like the Black Power movement in the 70s, and they travel the world, wherever they go, they adapt themselves to the local circumstances. And it's the same thing that just happened in 2021 with the Black Lives Matter movement. So Black Lives Matter in the United States would have been different to Black Lives Matter in Australia, where you were dealing with Tory Island straight people and Aboriginal people on the continent there. They would have had their own version. They would have had to define the way that that struggle, what Black Lives Matter meant to them. It's the same thing that happened when we came to Trinidad and Guyana, being an excellent example there by Dr. Tahimba Salandi. And of course, one of our leading ideologues in the movement was Walter Rodney, and he spoke quite clearly about why we define the movement in that way. On the second question, the question of the Trinidad and Tobago Revolution. Certainly, we're talking about a Trinidad and Tobago revolution. This was where our people put their foot forward and tried to make something of independence. We had a flag raised in 1962 and an anthem, but we didn't have the changes that were necessary to give substance and meaning to independence. And so, in 1970, Trinidad and Tobago rebelled. But to remove Black Power from that definition is something that would have happened decades after by what I would call, but of course it started off with McCandless Dagger making a statement. And of course, those people who would have been close to him in NJAC then decided to work with that. But if you look at the way the conference itself was advertised, you could see that they have walked that back. There's just no evidence to suggest. I mean, the people throughout the entire period, use the expression. They had all the imagery and so on of the Black Power movement. So it doesn't have any historical credibility. It would be redefining the movement to remove the Black Power from it entirely. And I need to make that 100% clear. Let me bring in Brother Kamau, who's been smiling and gesturing there. Perhaps he has a comment that he wants to make before we continue discussion. It's 9:11. We have 4 more minutes, gentlemen.
I'm not sure how much I can contribute at this point given the time that's remaining, but I would want to congratulate Dr. Salandi on what would have been a Herculean task to try and summarize such powerful panels into 1 minute and 2 minute responses. Kudos to you, my Pan African brother. Question, if I could, at this point in time, I'm not sure if from a production perspective we are allowed any more questions at this point, but perhaps a closing thought. In my mind, we need to have what we call a highest common factor. That would allow for all of the Pan-African struggles to congeal. I'm talking about present continuous struggles to congeal, to really come together, to unite. It has been our Achilles heel. Beyond just trying to make it cosmopolitan and bring in other ethnic groups, which I find to be quite laudable. The brown community, the indigenous community, other people, that's fine. But even from an African perspective, it doesn't seem to have as yet, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but it's my closing thought. We don't seem to have as yet one rallying philosophical, cosmological framework that we are operating with. There seems to be the common theme, of course, of freedom and the need for reparations and repair. But the key question has always been towards what? What is the end game? What does that look like for all of us, especially insofar as we are such a diverse group? And so maybe at another time and another opportunity, we could look at that in greater detail. What is the end game? It is unfinished business, that is for certain. But what does the finished business look like? I would love to be able to continue such a dialogue with such erudite gentlemen, the likes of yourselves. And I close there for now.
Yes, thank you. So there's really a need for us to harness the lessons of the 1970s and use that to chart an alternative form of development that is more inclusive, more decolonial. And I fear that sometimes we focus too much on commonality, which is important, but we also have to focus on differences. So the African and Indian experiences, for example, were not the same. There were some commonalities, but there were also some key differences. And we have to recognize both in moving forward to forge a society that is inclusive and different from what our colonial and post-independence leaders gave to us.
Yes, Dr. Fergus, you want to say anything in closing? We have 1 minute left.
No. I accept to compliment our brother Taimba for an excellent program.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just wrap up by saying that, indeed 1970 was our revolution to give form and substance to independence. And of course, Brother Frantz Fanon, who was one of the most important thinkers in that period, not that he lived in that period, but his literature was front and center in the period. He said that we needed to retrace the lines of violence to determine the actions that we must take to find liberation. And I think that's exactly what the movement did. And so to respond one more time to Dr. Fergus's question, one of the lines of violence in the colonial period was to divide, the society in peculiar and particular ways. And that would have been something that would have been addressed. One of the lines of violence was to remove people of color from places of power in terms of economics, in terms of education, and so on. All those things, everything that the Black Power generation could discern coming out of the colonial movement, they tried to address in 1970. And of course, we salute them on this anniversary, as we would every anniversary going into the future. Thank you very much, brothers, for being here. I'm sorry Dr. Knox wasn't here. I would have loved to hear what she thought of this. We want to thank Karen and the in studio, and of course all our listeners here in Trinidad and Tobago, across the Caribbean and across the world. Good night.